So with all the pictures, I'm sorry, I don't speak Portuguese, but after all the pictures were taken, I think you must have thought I was Cristiano Ronaldo or Deco or Figo or somebody. No, I'm just open source Matt. So I'm actually not going to talk a lot about Alfresco. I'm going to try to set some context for why Alfresco is important, but really why open source is important. And maybe if you can help me out, how many of the people in here are with what I would consider enterprises or small to medium-sized enterprises, not vendors, not consulting companies, but end customers like Portuguese government or, okay, and how many are with like either existing or potential Alfresco partners, system integrators? Okay, maybe 50-50. Good. So despite the bad economy, I bring some good news, and that is that open source is everywhere. And you may ask, well, why is this good news? And I'll explain that. But whether measured in terms of number of lines of code, which is to the left, or the number of new projects, open source is growing exponentially. While I'm speaking here, there will be probably 10 new open source projects created on Google Code or SourceForge or some other open source code hosting site. The growth has been amazing. The reason that this is good is if you are an end customer, an end user of open source, it can save you a lot of money. And if you are someone who sells software or implements software, it can help you make a lot of money. So as an example, I tracked the blue line is the Dow Jones Industrial Average, so the stock market in the United States. And as that has gone down, the green line is Alfresco sales. But this is not just Alfresco. I advise 10 open source companies. And with every company, it's pretty much the exact same phenomenon. As the economy has gone down, their sales have gone up. As customers have looked to save money by using open source. So it's a good time. What it's done is it's made us much more efficient with our IT dollars, or euros, I should say. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but Gartner and Forrester both did surveys of enterprise customers and asked, are you planning to use open source software? If they would have asked this question 10 years ago, nobody would have said yes. Even if they would have asked 5 years ago, many people would have said, yes, we are considering using Linux, but we are using it for non-essential tasks, file and print servers, email servers, things like that. Today, when Gartner asked the question, are you planning to use open source software, you see operating systems is roughly 100%. That's the top number. But even open source applications, people are either using it today or are considering using it within the next year, roughly 100%. So if you're not using open source software right now, you are in the minority. Gartner says that 85% of companies today are actively using open source software, and the other 15% are lying because they are using it, they just don't know it yet. Open source is being used, I'm willing to bet, in every single company represented in this room. You are already using open source software even if you don't know it. Someone within your company is using it. And the reason is clear. So when asked, so IDC to the right, IDC made the statement, open source produces better quality software. 81% of CIOs surveyed agreed with this statement. And so that's nice. But the reason that open source has done so well, if you look to the left, the reason is that it actually delivers. So when Forrester asked, how has open source met your organization's expectations? And they said, did you actually reduce costs with open source? Did you save money? 87% said yes. Did you get improved quality from open source? 92% said yes. Ease of integration, 86% said yes. Faster innovation, 82%. These are really, really good things. So open source is not simply a way of saving money, although many people use open source because they want to save software licensing costs, and that's a very good reason. But the real value of open source, and what we find at Alfresco, is companies start with Alfresco or other open source software to save money, but the reason that they keep using it is because they get other benefits, flexibility, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, reduced lock-in to Alfresco or to some other vendor. In fact, we asked 2 weeks ago in Portland, Oregon, I asked the CTO at Sony Pictures, makes movies like Spider-Man. I said, did you start using open source in a big way? He said, no, we used it for, I think it was just Linux that they started using open source. But they had such a good experience there that they started using Spring for Java development. And then they started using MySQL, and then they started using Alfresco, and then they started using various other open source technologies, to the point that now when they choose a new software at Sony Pictures, the default is open source. It is expected that they will use open source unless they find that it can't meet their needs. And that is the natural progression of most companies that I'm seeing now, is they start with open source and then they go to proprietary software if, for whatever reason, the open source software doesn't meet their needs. But increasingly, they don't ever need to make that choice. So this is nice, but what about content management systems like Alfresco or Drupal or Joomla or other content management? 56% expect to adopt an open source CMS by 2010, according to Forrester. And I gave some of the reasons earlier, but one thing that's I think important is that, again, usually people start using open source in non-critical tasks. But where it ends up being used is for the most important tasks. So IDC did this survey 2 years ago, and I think these numbers would be even higher today, but they asked, for the places where you're using open source, how important are those projects? And the vast majority were either critically important or of high importance. And then when they asked, for these projects, will you increase your adoption of open source, decrease, keep the same? The vast majority to the right were increase or keep the same. Very few were planning to stop using open source. Again, I think this is a testimony of how good a lot of the open source software is.